Welcome back to Proxam, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about whether or not the Craftworld Eldar are broken in 10th edition. So this is something that I've heard quite a bit from a wide spectrum of gamers that play 40k. And that is that, basically the Eldar, with their unparalleled mastery, Strands of Fate, and datasheet reveals, are OP. So OP, in fact, that some people are saying they should be nerfed to the ground before 10th edition even starts. And with this kind of stuff, I often try to keep an open mind because Eldar have indeed been OP before. Not often and not regularly, but they have been. And I'll be the first to admit that we have had OP codexes, one of which was in 6th edition. And a lot of you might remember this, but the 6th edition Eldar codex was completely broken on launch, and back then GW didn't do regular FAQs, and they didn't do regular points balances and things like that for competitive play. So for much of 6th edition, Eldar was a complete terror on the battlefield. 6th edition was, an edition where a lot of people spammed things like flyers, and were generally running some pretty degenerate lists in competitive play, and the Eldar were right up there with them. But what made Eldar so OP back then? Well, back then, in my opinion, there was only one real reason why the Eldar were super overpowered. Well, two really, but let's talk about the first one. The first reason was that the scatter laser, which was an Eldar heavy weapon we still have today, basically gave the rest of the unit rerolls to hit. So that means that every single unit that could take a scatter laser was getting rerolls to hit on all of their stuff, if the scatter laser hit their target. Which is extremely overpowered if you think about it, because that means that every single unit that could take one was, in essence, its own guide. So what a lot of people loved doing in this edition was taking Warwalkers, putting one scatter laser on them, and then putting one Bright Lance or one missile launcher on them. Basically, you never had to guide the Warwalkers because they would guide themselves. They were their own guide. And the same thing was true for a lot of other units in the Eldar Codex. The other thing was that the Eldar Codex was extremely cost effective. Stuff in the Eldar Codex cost, honestly, much less than it should have. So we had an OP Codex. There has been times where we had this. However, I think that in this case, when, A, we haven't even seen our points yet, and B, there are a lot of other things that exist now that didn't exist in 6th edition, I think the notion that the Eldar are broken on release is frankly quite ridiculous. And in this video, I'm going to go into why that is and give non-Eldar players and Eldar players alike the reasons for that. All right, without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the video. So first, a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be doing a general consensus of the Warhammer 40k community on the Craftworld Eldar so far. I'm going to be showing you my take on the issue, which obviously you guys know by now is that they're not OP, and some numbers to prove my point. So I am going to go into the facts of why they're not OP. I'm just going to, I'm not going to rail on and on about why I think they're not OP and the indignity of, being called OP and so forth. I'm going to go into the specifics and talk about the facts. Because honestly, any player could just sit there and say, no, something's not OP because it's my army and I'm the one playing it and I've had, this much experience with the army and I know them best. Well, anybody could do that, right? But what I want to do, hopefully, is prove objectively that Eldar are not an OP faction on release. And the general consensus so far of the Warhammer community on the Craftworld Eldar has been that just they're OP, they're busted, they're broken on launch. I've heard it all, guys. GW did it again with the Eldar. Oh my God. Eldar are going to be this, super OP faction. They're unbalanced. I won't play against them, etc. I've heard it all. On forums, I've heard it. In my local game store, I've heard it. Even among my own group, I've heard it a little bit. A little bit jokingly, of course. I do play with a group of gamers that are pretty chill. But even so, I've heard a lot of this online, and I've heard a lot of this in pretty much everywhere I've been. So, and generally, again, there are a lot of people out there with the misconception that Eldar are going to be impossible to beat, including some prominent Eldar players themselves. I've seen some videos on YouTube even. Eldar are super OP now. They have the strongest faction reveal yet. They're going to be very hard to deal with. They're busted. I've heard these things on YouTube itself. So here's my complete take on the issue. So Eldar are going to be strong and hard-hitting, obviously. The faction reveal was good. We did get some good rules, but that comes with the weaknesses of the Eldar in general, being very fragile and being hard-hitting, but, not able to take a hit. That means they're going to be far from OP. Eldar vehicles are going to be much less durable than their counterparts in other factions, and will now have to reveal more of their forces because there's no more battle focus, guys. We don't have battle focus anymore, so our whole army can't just pop in and out of cover at will and get in and out of line of sight. The other thing is fate dice are random, and in-game generation by Farseers and Guardians can be shut down. And again, fate dice, you roll them, you could roll really good, get those high numbers, or you could roll really bad. You might have to re-roll this a couple times in the beginning, and throughout the course of the game, you might have to really rely on Farseers to boost those fate dice up to the numbers you need, to be good. And lastly, counterplay does exist to the various things that Eldar can do on the battlefield. So let's go ahead and jump right in and talk about some numbers to prove my point. So let's start at the very beginning. Strands of Fate allows you to roll 12 dice in the beginning of the game, and you can use those dice to substitute rolls throughout that game. So the average spread would dictate an average of 2 for each result. So you get 2 1s, 2 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s, 2 5s, and 2 6s. This is the absolute average of what you're going to expect. Obviously, none of us are going to see this average result with 12 dice on one roll, right? It's just not really going to happen in a lot of games. We might get, 3 3s instead of 2 3s, or, we might get 3 4s instead of 2 4s, or whatever it is, right? But on average, this is what we're going to be looking at, and this is what you're going to have to expect. And there is very much a possibility that you roll a lot of 1s or a lot of 2s, and you have to pick up those dice and re-roll it, which means you're using 1 less fate dice. So you're probably going to need 11 dice, or have 11 dice instead of 12. 1s and 2s are either going to be unusable in a lot of cases, or very hard to use without a Farseer nearby, which leaves us with 8 effective dice. And again, there is absolutely no scenario in this new rule set where the roll of a 1 would be good for anything except exchanging it with a Farseer, right? And of course, we know Farseers are models on the battlefield. Farseers can be shut down. Rolls of a 2 are barely going to be useful. They're going to be useful on models with a 2+ armor save, if and only if the weapon has AP nothing, AP 0. They're going to be useful in situations where a fire prism is like overkilling a target. But again, if you need a 2+ to hit or wound on something, why are you using a strands dice for it? Right? It's pretty useless. I mean, I guess if you really needed it, to make sure that you passed, but in most cases, it's just not going to be that good. And that's on top of the fact that most Eldar units hit pretty reliably anyways. We've always hit on a 3+ with a vast majority of our units in the last couple of editions. And rolls of, again, a 3+ with rerolls via Unparalleled Mastery or Detachment rule, it's very unlikely that you will actually need fate dice for this, right? So if you need a 3+ to hit with a Bright Lance, chances are Unparalleled Mastery is going to be enough. And when rolling to wound, high-strength weapons like Bright Lances, again, are likely to get through anyways on a 3+ or 4+ with rerolls. So even if you're going against something like a Land Raider with toughness 12, your strength of 12 wounding on a 4+ with rerolls has a 75% chance of going through, which is pretty good, right? So most of the time, unless you really need to guarantee it, which, I could see some people using a 4 on that just to make sure it happens. But chances are you're going to get that roll anyway. And Expert Crafters is actually something that the Craftworld Eldar have had access to for a couple of editions now. In 8th edition, we had Expert Crafters pretty much throughout the whole edition. The 8th edition codex also had it in 9th. And obviously, as well, we've had access to it in the 9th edition codex via the custom traits, which we could have used both of them to get essentially Expert Crafters again. However, as many of us know now, that was not the most optimal choice. Oftentimes you wouldn't pick that, and oftentimes you would be picking things like Swift Strikes, you'd be picking things like, Hail of Doom and things like that. Maybe Masterful Shots. So in both of these cases, using fate dice may not be super impactful. Again, A 3-up with a reroll, it's not going to be super impactful that you're going to use a fate dice on it, and same thing with the wound roll if you're rolling bright lances. Now, I think what people are most upset about is actually the damage roll. So if you look at this, the damage rolls versus hard targets are mostly, what people are thinking about. But even then, the damage increase isn't as OP as it sounds. So bright lances do an average of d6 plus 2. That's going to average 5.5 damage rolled normally. So if you are just rolling your bright lance normally, on average, you're going to get 5 or 6 damage on it, which is pretty good. The bright lance is better than it was last edition at dealing damage to vehicles. A fate dice of a 6 will net you 8 damage. So on the highest fate dice roll, it'll net you 8 damage, which is 2.5 damage higher than normal. And this is a good boost. But this is not game-breaking by any means. This is not something so far-fetched. This is not doubling your damage, right? It's significantly increasing your damage by 2.5, but this is nothing insane, right? Just think about it. It basically means that instead of 2 bright lances hitting and wounding a target to, do 16 wounds if you have fate dice, you would need 3 bright lances to do essentially the same thing. That's really all it's doing. It's just increasing the efficiency of your bright lances so that for every 2 bright lances using fate dice on damage, it would equal 3 bright lances if used normally. And also, you only have a couple of 6s to work with, right? Yes, you can use a Farseer once per turn, but again, like I'll say later in this video, Farseers can be shut down, right? So really, you're not going to have access to a bunch of 6s throughout the game. You may have access to a couple 6s in the beginning in the first few turns, and you may have access to 1 or maybe 2 as the turns go on. Also, a good point to mention is that if you use your fate dice on damage rolls, you will have none to use defensively for invulnerable saves or armor saves. And this is very important to keeping non-expendable units alive. I'm thinking the Wraithlord, right? Wraithlords have a 3+ armor save. Last cannons have AP -3. Having a 6 to make sure you make an armor save with a Wraithlord could be very important, right? You may not want to use your strands dice for damage if you want to keep that Wraithlord alive. And also, same goes for battle shock tests, right? You need high rolls to ensure you can hold objectives and score points. If your opponent is taking away your ability to score, right, like on Guardian squads who need to hold objectives to generate those miracle dice, or fate dice, I should say, then you're going to need some saved to be able to pass that battle focus. So you're going to need to save 5s and 6s to make sure you pass. I mean, really, you just need 5s, but sometimes you may not have that many 5s to use. So you do have to keep that into consideration as well. All right, so let's address the common complaints with some common sense. So here is probably one of the biggest complaints that I've heard from people in 10th edition talking about the Eldar. But you can use a fate dice after you roll, and there's nothing to say you can't. That's fucking OP, right? I've heard people say this. However, this is the common sense answer to that. I'm 99% sure that this will either be fixed with an FAQ or it is already clarified in the full index rules, which we haven't seen yet. There's no way GW is going to allow us, as any army for that matter, to basically roll a dice, fail it, and then basically just replace it with a strands dice instead, right? This is going to be clarified in the rules somehow. We haven't seen the full rule of Strands of Fate. We haven't seen the amendments or anything like that. So we definitely can't say that GW is going to allow this to happen. And again, GW typically does not allow armies in any edition to roll dice and then when they miss, change that to an automatic hit. That's never really happened, right? You either have to pick beforehand or you're allowed to re-roll the dice, right? You're not allowed to, just make something automatic hit after you miss. That's ridiculous. So I think there would be something in the rules, either the index or maybe an FAQ that GW will release alongside of the rules that clarifies that, yes, you cannot just roll the dice like normal, and then when it misses and you don't get what you want, change it to an automatic hit using fate dice. All right, so let's look at complaint number 2. Eldar are going to do way too much damage to vehicles and monsters. So here's the common sense answer to that. Every single army revealed so far has extremely deadly anti-large tools at their disposal, and this is nothing new. Obviously, the Eldar are going to get a very similar treatment because guess what? Every army is getting it, right? And by the way, Sisters of Battle as well. I know the Sisters, have multi-meltas and things like that, and typically they don't have really strong anti-tank, but even they have really good anti-tank, right? The Exorcist has an anti-tank option, which is pretty good. And then they have Miracle Dice as well, which is basically the same thing as a Fate Dice. So yes, Sisters of Battle can do the exact same thing with multi-meltas. Space Marines have some pretty deadly weapons, and they have Oath of Moment, which allows them to reroll all hits and wounds. That's going to make them extremely efficient against all targets that have Oath of Moment on them. And, even Necrons, right, have lethal hits on their basic gauze weapons, which causes auto wounds. That'll be great against high toughness vehicles. And they also have the Doomsday Arc, which if it stands still, gets devastating wounds. And it has a significant amount of attacks. So, yes, other factions have really deadly anti-armor. Eldar do as well. That's not a surprise and shouldn't be, a surprise to anybody who's following the reveals. Okay, so let's look at complaint number 3. Eldar have too many rerolls and auto successes on their dice rolls. Here's the common sense answer to that, and this one deserves a two-parter because, in my opinion, it's especially stupid. Number 1, Eldar have always been the reroll faction. We've always gotten rerolls on stuff because we are Eldar, right? That's how our faction operates. We've had Guide, we've had Psychic powers that allow for rerolls and stuff like that. Basically, since the introduction of the Eldar to the game, they have gotten this. They've always been the reroll faction, and with the loss of Psychic-based rerolls, the changes compensate for that. Guys, we have lost Guide. We have lost Doom. We have lost these reroll abilities. So therefore, GW, because we have lost these abilities, has decided that we're going to make it a detachment rule that Eldar get rerolls still, because that's fair. That is a fair compensation to the faction that just lost things like, again, Guide and Doom, right? Which were very powerful things in the Eldar Codex. And basically seen in every single Eldar list. So if they don't have that, they need some way to get rerolls once more. And again, many other factions were also given strong reroll and auto success mechanics. Oath of Moment, guys, right? Miracle Dice from Sisters of Battle, lethal hits, etc., right? A lot of armies are getting these abilities that allow them to reroll stuff or auto succeed on their damage or wound rolls. That's just what's happening here. Right? So the complaint that Eldar have too many rerolls and auto successes, to me, kind of falls on flat ears because, again, what's changed? We've always had rerolls. We've always had things like Guide and Doom. This is essentially the same thing, just spread out a little bit over the whole army instead of concentrated on one or two big units. And lastly, let's look at the fact that counterplay does indeed exist, and you have to use your brain to be successful at Warhammer 40k, especially when dealing with, more experienced Eldar players. You do have to think about what you're going to do to win. You can't just march up on the board, throw your most expensive units out in the middle of, no man's land and expect them to survive. Experienced Eldar players will take advantage of those mistakes, and they will capitalize on them very quickly. So using defensive abilities and stratagems can make it harder to use Fate Dice in the first place. Popping Smoke, the Stealth Special Rule -1 to hit or -1 to wound abilities will also help use up better dice rolls. If I need a 4 to hit your vehicle instead of a 3, I'm going to have to use a Fate Dice of a 4 instead of a 3, and that's going to lower my chances of having good successes later on in the game. And maybe I would have to use a Fate Dice on a hit roll if you had some sort of -1 to hit ability. Second, most of the time you will get some sort of save for your large units. Again, there's not a lot of AP in this game right now that is going to completely ignore all armor now. So on your 3+ or 2+ armor save units, you will get an armor save, either 5+ or 6+ against most Eldar weapons, Bright Lances and stuff. Your lighter vehicles probably won't get a save against the Fire Prism, but again, I could compare that to the Baneblade Cannon. I could compare that to, a lot of other stuff, right? So, yeah, you're probably not going to get a save against those types of devastating weapons, but you're going to get a save against Bright Lances. And you also have invulnerable saves. So a lot of units have invulnerable saves as well. of at least a 4 or 5 plus, right? I know certainly that demons have a 4 plus invulnerable save on a lot of their larger monsters, and I'm sure that will be the case for a lot of, units out there. And lastly, fate dice generating units are very killable. Guardians and Farseers are squishy by nature. They're Eldar units. They have a toughness value of 3. They have a 4 plus armor save. And they're very susceptible to close combat. They're trash in melee. They will die very easily when engaged, even to regular assault marines. So, yeah, those impossible to kill fate dice generating models that you guys are talking about, not Eldar players particularly, but, players of other factions who are looking at that and saying, oh my god, Guardians are OP now because they could just farm fate dice the entire game, or Farseers are OP because they can just change the fate dice to a 6 whenever they want. If you hate them so much, find a way to kill them. And again, most competitive armies will have tools in their toolbox to deal with units that are sitting on a backfield objective, because they've always had, right? You don't want to let somebody just farm primary victory points the entire game for free. You want to be able to have something that can threaten these targets, either in turns 3, 4, or 5. If you don't have something in your army that can do that, you might want to consider building your list a little bit better, because this is something every army is going to have at their disposal. So you really need to make sure you have the tools to deal with it. And let me give you an example, right? Orcs are a faction that a vast majority of their units wants to be in close engagement with you, right? They don't have a lot of long-range shooters. They have a couple, but for the most part, they're not a gunline army. They want to get in your face as soon as possible to do some smashing. However, every single army needs a unit that can just sit on an objective in the backfield, because if all of your units are in the enemy deployment zone in the middle of the field, you're going to have nothing in your backfield to score on objectives. So orcs have this unit called Grots, and they are very weak, but they score a bunch of points on primary and secondary objectives. And I imagine it's going to be the same thing in 10th. You're going to need units to sit on those backfield objectives. And even though Grots are only like 50 points, your army is going to need to have some sort of tools available to get rid of them. So for the Eldar army in 9th edition, it was Shadow Weavers. It was things like jet bikes who could very quickly get into the enemy deployment zone and shoot them down. In some cases, it was things like Shroud Runners that could get there and eliminate them off the objective. It's things like that. So in a lot of cases, yes, you will need tools to deal with those units, even if they may do no damage. And the other thing is this: Guardians need to control an objective to generate fate dice, right? And a Farseer needs to be within 12 inches of the friendly target to change that fate dice into a 6. So a couple of things you could do is you could use strategic reserves that come in behind the enemy army and neutralize the biggest threats. Or you could use Battle Shock to your advantage, right? You could Battle Shock the Guardian unit. There's going to be a lot of tools that a lot of armies are going to have to deal Battle Shock to enemy units, right? So again, Guardians cannot hold objectives when Battle Shocked. So this is a very common tactic that you can use to prevent Guardians from actually scoring on objectives. And the other thing is that, again, the Eldar player is going to need to save Strands dice to make sure that they can pass those Battle Shock tests, which means less damage, which means less armor saves, right? And lastly, if you are afraid of Eldar damage, don't throw away your most expensive units out in the open without vetting the situation first, right? If you're on turn 2 or even turn 1 and you move your Land Raider out into the middle of the battlefield, yeah, expect it to die, because you're moving it right out into the center of the battlefield. You have no cover, you have no obscuring terrain, and Eldar units are very quick and can maneuver into a position very easily to be able to shoot your Land Raider down. And yes, you might see situations where a couple of Warwalkers with Bright Lances are able to kill your Land Raider because it's out in the open, right? So definitely don't expect units that you throw out into the open like that to survive against an Eldar army. We are designed with that in mind, right? We are designed with the ability to take out enemy units very efficiently. So it is something that you have to think about when playing against Eldar. So instead of, running up your Land Raider across the battlefield turn 1, maybe wait a couple turns, right? Wait for a better situation, or wait for a chance that you can, threaten the Eldar army with multiple units coming from multiple different angles, and that will probably work much better for you. All right, so in conclusion, are Eldar broken on release? No, not at all. They're certainly strong in the right hands, as always. They've always been strong with the good players. But a lot of other factions look very powerful as well, right? Space Marines look very good. Chaos Knights look very good if you take a look at those. Necrons look okay. Again, we don't know the full rules, but Necrons are looking pretty good with their gauze weapons and stuff like that. Tower really looking still pretty strong with their shooting. So there's a lot of strong factions, and Counterplay, again, does exist. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, we have not seen the points costs to determine how efficient units will be. It could very well be that a Bright Lance is much more expensive than the other options because of this unparalleled mastery and Strands of Fate combo that we can do, right? That could very well be the case. And even though, it will still be worth it to take Bright Lances in your army, you're not going to see people spam them so much because, well, they're just too expensive to do that with, right? So you might not actually see people doing these kinds of things with their Eldar. Because again, we just don't know how much stuff costs yet. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thank you for watching this video. And thank you to all my patrons and supporters out there. Again, thank you so much for supporting the channel over the last months. I really appreciate it. If you guys do want to support the channel via Patreon or PayPal, I will leave the links in the description for you guys. And once again, thank you so much for your support. We're going to have a couple more videos coming out this week, hopefully, covering the various aspects of the Eldar faction focus. I have a video coming out soon talking about basically how army construction is going to work and what are the best ways to construct an army in 10th edition based on what we know. And I will have a couple of other videos coming out later this week as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out, and thanks for watching, everybody. See you in the next video.